Hi everyone! Today we're going to be diving into Slewfoot, A Tale of Bewitchery by Brom. It is a folk horror novel that blends dark folklore, complex characters, and some seriously grisly scenes. I wanted to share my full thoughts with you, everything from the characters to the philosophy, the writing style, and some of the things that kind of puzzled me as I was reading along. Be sure to like and subscribe for future reviews just like this one. Before we continue, I do want to give some trigger warnings for violence, cruelty, gore, animal death, and things of that nature. So let's get into it. So first off, the opening scene was perfect. We open up to a nameless creature refusing to wake up and open his eyes. He is being coaxed by these voices that we don't know who they belong to yet. And they're begging him to wake up and drink blood. And he doesn't want to do it. He's refusing. He wants to sleep. He wants to stay asleep. And of course, my first thought is, who is this and why is he so adamant about staying asleep? The intrigue was there for me. The opening scene, I think it was really well done. It brought the reader a lot of questions to ask themselves that would make us want to continue reading. And then we're thrown into this moment where the creature wakes up and just dives into eating this poor goat. We soon learn that this creature's name is Father, or he's referred to as Father. And later on in the book, he takes on the name Samson. He's given this name by Abatha, our main character. And this was after the goat that he does eat in the opening scene. Now, I really did enjoy Samson's backstory. I felt like a lot of this book was trying to explore this theme of who he was, what his purpose on this earth was, what he was meant to be, and why being this evil devil that everyone is characterizing him as just didn't settle right with him. It didn't feel right because he cannot reckon with this idea that he is purely evil. He knows that that doesn't make any sense. Throughout this book, he's just wandering around trying to figure out who he is and why he feels like a part of himself is missing. Eventually, we do get to know his backstory. We do learn his lore that a long time ago, he was the father of the wild folk. He was the protector of nature, of Mother Earth. And over time, he was twisted into this devilish character, this devilish creature. Not because he was evil, but because the wild folk, in their anger, in their frustration, in their need and desire for retribution, accidentally or poisoned him into being this dark devil. Now, what I loved about Samson's character is that he is not a clear-cut villain. Even though he's supposed to represent the Christian devil or explain maybe the origin of where the Christian devil came from, he is not, strictly speaking, an evil being. He realizes that he embodies both life and death. He is the savior and the slayer. And I feel like that is meant to symbolize, obviously, the balance of nature itself, the cycle of life and death. And I felt like it was really well done. I was interested in his backstory. I was glad that I was worried at some point that Brom wasn't, when he first gets to Mamuna Pet's cave and he goes to sleep inside of the skull. I was kind of worried that Brom was just going to leave it there and he was going to leave Abatha hanging and that was going to be that. But I'm glad that we did end up, it expanded a bit on his lore, a bit more on, obviously his story does not end with him falling asleep inside of the skull. I'll get to that in just a second about that particular thing. So in contrast with Wallace's character, who I do believe is more of a clear-cut villain, he is very clearly an awful person between the way that he treats his brother Edward and Abatha and tries to leave them hanging for his gambling debts by taking their farm and everything that they'd worked for, especially Edward, essentially trying to steal this farm back from him, even though they had made an agreement and Wallace was just trying to manipulate his brother. We see this from literally the first chapter. And he, throughout the book, just does some really heinous, awful, terrible things. But at the same time, I feel like Brom, despite the fact that Wallace was clearly an evil man, he still humanized him. by showing us his internal struggles, right? Throughout the book, we see him having this internal monologue with his father who has passed away, trying to basically justify to himself and to the ghost of his father in his mind that he's doing the right thing. And this was what he was raised to do and how he was brought up to be. And he's clearly, we can see how he has been shaped by this harsh puritanical culture that he was raised in. I also believe that in some sense, his father, who he's speaking to in his mind, is also meant to symbolize God in a way. This father figure that he feels the need to justify his morality, to justify his actions in order to absolve himself of the potential guilt that he could feel had this father figure actually been able to respond and tell him, hey, you're torturing this poor girl, you're trying to manipulate your brother, you're all this awful stuff. And so I feel like through his internal monologue of trying to talk to the ghost of his father, it's also in a way him talking to God himself. And I thought that was interesting. I did feel like it humanized his character. I still hated Wallace and I thought he was a piece of shit. But I did find that interesting that Brom was exploring the morality of many different characters in this book, not just Samson as the devil, not just Abatha, but also people like Wallace as well. Now, one of the most compelling things about Slewfoot is how Brom uses these very gory visuals to explore these big philosophical questions about religion, about humanity, about our relationship as creatures with nature. This story asks, how did we come to believe in the Christian God? Or what place does the Christian God have in relation to nature? Can someone like Abatha hold both the devil and God in her heart at the same time? Obviously, she comes from a long line of witches, and this is something that is explored throughout the novel, where between the lock of her mother's hair and all of her grandmothers and mothers that came before her, it dives into how she tried to balance both the idea of this Christian God alongside this wilderness spirit that is Samson. Now, in the climax of the story, Abatha does have a powerful vision in which she sees all of the eyes of all of these gods and how they're all together in the same space. And she realizes it's all one thing. It's all one God. It's all part of the same thing. She is God, God is her, and how everything is all connected. Now, for anyone that is new to this concept or has never explored the idea of that before, I feel like this could have been a very groundbreaking moment for them. But if you are someone who has explored different religions and explored the philosophies behind different and varying religions, you might have come to a similar conclusion in which it's basically different paths to the same destination kind of thing. Now, I don't say this to invalidate anyone's faith or their religious practices. It's all just to say that I think if more people realized this sentiment or came to the same conclusion, that the world would be quite a different place than what it is right now. Now, Brom's writing style for this novel really stood out to me. He uses period appropriate language, words like mayhaps and phrases like on this night that feel like they really do belong in the 1600s, but it's still very clear and readable for a modern audience. The imagery is vivid, and in the gory scenes, it's very grimy, and I feel like it fit the tone of the story pretty perfectly. The writing is concise enough to make this a quick read, but rich enough to immerse the reader in this eerie world. I felt like Brom utilized exposition, dialogue, and action very effectively, which made the pacing of this book really perfect for me as a reader. Now, here's where I got a bit confused. Edward dies pretty early on in chapter 2. Now, I expected it to happen a bit later. I wasn't necessarily surprised that he died, but I just was expecting it to happen later on in the book. But bold choice. I was hoping we would get to be able to know him a bit more because, frankly, he was such a sweet character and I really did like Edward. Although I will say that for the brief time that we got to know him as an audience, the author did do a good job at giving the reader a chance to see what kind of person Edward really was in such a short amount of time. Now, what I struggled with was the idea that Abatha, a woman and an outsider to this community, could take control of Edward's farm. Historically, women in Puritan society had very limited rights, especially regarding the ownership of property. Not to mention how outspoken and fiery Abatha was as a character, which would have made her so unlikable to the townspeople of Sutton, which it did. They did not like her. Most of these people did not like her. They did not respect her, and they thought that she was evil. And you take that into account that the land was legally Wallace's. He was the one that had a deed to this farm. Yes, he made a deal with Edward, but once Edward died, I feel like logically it would have been kind of a no-brainer that the property would revert back to Wallace's ownership and that he would be able to do whatever he wanted with it. It didn't seem realistic, like that the Reverend Carter and Reverend Smith and the third one whose name I can't remember, that they would agree to allow Abatha to make this last payment and then eventually take ownership of the property if she were able to come through with this last payment. I felt like historical accuracy wise, that did not make any sense. Although I do understand that it was necessary in order to lay out the plot of the story. Without this moment so early on in the book, the rest of the plot would be non-existent. So I understand why Brom did it, but it did feel like a stretch, historically speaking. Now, because we're talking about historical accuracy, I do want to take a moment to discuss something that deserves attention, and that is the portrayal of the indigenous population and how the book handles native folklore. So I came across this very detailed 2-star review on Goodreads. I'm going to scroll through it while you guys can pause to read at any point to read it. I also did include reviewer's name and the date that it was posted. Usually I try to block that out, but because even though it was 2 stars, I did resonate a lot with what this person had to say. And the reviewer points out that while the story engages with native folklore, it does fall short in several key areas. They argue that the novel overlooks or oversimplifies crucial principles of indigenous spirituality and culture, which can feel like a missed opportunity or even problematic erasure. The review highlights that the portrayal sometimes leans into stereotypes or doesn't fully respect the depth and the complexity of Native traditions. This is a very significant critique, especially given how central the natural world and spiritual connections are to this novel. From my perspective, while Slewfoot does incorporate indigenous elements, it does not deeply engage with the cultural context or provide a fully authentic representation. This is something to keep in mind as you read or discuss the book, recognizing both its artistic merits and the areas where it could have been more culturally sensitive or accurate. It is a reminder of the importance of diverse voices and careful research when stories draw from indigenous traditions. I appreciate that this critique exists, and I do hope that it encourages readers and reviewers to think critically about representation in folklore and horror. That's what I want to say about that. Now, characters like Sarah Carter and Sheriff Pitkin initially to me seemed like stereotypical strict Puritans enforcing harsh rules. But as the story progresses, we do see more layers in these characters. Sarah, for example, reveals that her grandmother was also a cunning woman and that she used to do a lot of the similar potions and charms and believed them to be God working through her. So this added a bit more depth beyond the authoritarian reverend wife. Now, Brom doesn't just rely on stereotypes for these particular characters, he humanizes them. He shows their struggles and their pushback on conformity within this puritanical society. It did make the story feel a bit more nuanced, at least in regard to these two characters specifically. I felt like my idea of them changed pretty drastically as the story went on, which I think was part of Brom's intention. When the story began and Sarah Carter is yelling at Abatha to stop peddling her charms and all this stuff, I had a specific idea in mind of who Sarah Carter was. And then obviously, as the two of these characters interact more throughout the story, we learn that there is more substance to Sarah than just being the Reverend's wife. Now, in regard to Sarah's character, I do want to talk a bit about her reaction to finding out that Abatha actually was a witch. By the very end, when there's the whole everything's going down and Abatha is hunting these people down and chasing them and stuff like that, I did feel like Sarah's reaction to discovering Abatha was a witch.
Hold on! Her sister was a witch!
Which was pretty spot on. You figure she had just endured hours and hours of torture. She was being literally slowly crushed to death. She had to endure humiliation, torture, all of this stuff, and was almost put to death because she was so convinced of Abatha's innocence, right? She almost lost everything. And this felt like such a human moment, which really only added to my opinion that Sarah was a much more deep and multi-dimensional character than just the Reverend's wife. Now, something that I really enjoyed was Brom's use of third omniscient narration. This is rare, not just in modern horror, but in most genres where limited third or first person point of view really dominate. Now, one of the reasons I love third omniscient is because it allows us to see things that other characters don't know what is happening. We're not just focusing on our main character. We're able to focus and see how other characters are utilizing their time within this story. Now, we got to peek into the minds of not just Abatha or Samson, but we got to see some of Ansel. We got to see quite a bit of Wallace, and we also got to see characters like Jesus Thunderbird. We see conversations and interactions happening all over the setting, which enriches the story's world and adds a lot of complexity and nuance to these characters and the way, not that they just interact within their own minds, but the way that they interact with each other, right? We get to see Wallace having conversations with Magistrate Watson and Lord Mansfield in his office, in his home. And this is something obviously that neither Samson nor Abatha, who I would argue are the main characters for the most part, they don't know that this is all happening. We get to peek inside of Wallace's mind and see his conversation with his father. We get to see Jesus Thunderbird kind of trying to rationalize to himself that I'm just going to go in, I'm going to steal the corn from Abatha's barn, and it'll be done. We get to explore a lot of these characters in a way that you just do not get to have when you are reading a book that is limited third or first person. And I love third omniscient. I wish that it was more common, but I really just want to give Brom a thumbs up on that. I feel like for this particular story as well, this was an excellent storytelling device. And I appreciated it. I enjoyed it quite thoroughly. So obviously I would be remiss if I did not talk about all of the horror, gory scenes in a horror novel, right? Wallace's death, being eaten alive and choking on beetles. Brutal, visceral. I loved it. The description of these beetles literally burrowing into his flesh. Trigger warning, right? It reminded me of this scene in The Mummy. Loved it. I enjoyed it. But something that I found myself wondering is why Ansel was the one to be sacrificed at the pawpaw tree instead of Wallace, who was Abatha's main tormentor throughout this story, right? That's no secret that Wallace was the one to really keep the story moving in terms of being the antagonist. Now, Ansel, through his character, he showed the most fear and he was kept alive the longest. But symbolically, Wallace's sacrifice would have felt more fitting, in my opinion. Now, in regard to Abatha's rage, right? If we're talking gory horror, right? There is a moment in the book, I'm going to read you a quote in a second, and I feel like it really captured her fierce desire for revenge. She says, 2 eyes for an eye. If I can kill him twice, 3 times, 4 times, I'll do it. And each time I will dance a jig of joy upon his bloody corpse. Perfect. Loved it. That's exact. I was like, get it, girl. Absolutely. I feel like that line embodies her transformation. Goes from finally accepting Samson's blood and becoming this devilish creature. She goes from being a victim of this puritanical society to a terrifying vengeance. It is raw, it's primal, and full of this dark joy. And to be honest, I felt like Brom could have leaned even more into that energy throughout the climax of this book. I felt like he could have pushed the horror a bit further. The horror scenes that existed, I think were well done. They were well written. I would have enjoyed more of it. I would have enjoyed more gore, but I feel like one of the reasons why he may have decided not to do that was perhaps because he wanted not overindulge and to not cheapen these moments of horror and gore. So maybe that's why. Now, Abatha's death at the end, it felt a bit rushed, chasing Ansel into musket fire and being shot several times. It felt anticlimactic compared to what I was expecting. Still, the ending where she comes back and gets to live for centuries with the forest creatures was pretty satisfying. I did enjoy that. Now, because we're talking about Abatha's rage, I kept thinking that Brom kind of held back on fully embracing Abatha's feminine rage. You think that she is this outsider character who has been basically sold into this Puritan society that she didn't want to be a part of. Obviously, we get a bit of backstory of that with her father selling her. And you think the 2 years that she has spent and endured basically being given dirty looks and threatened with violence and shame and all of this stuff, that the culmination of finally having the power to do something about it, because ultimately she wasn't even the one to take revenge on the town. It was Samson. He was the one that burned the church, the courtroom, whatever it was. He was the one that burned all those people alive. She went for Wallace. She went for the magistrate. And again, I feel like Brom could have pushed that even further. Yeah, the magistrate cut out his own tongue. I was pretty intense, but I just wish he had pushed it further. I wish he had jammed his tongue right up his fucking ass and made him puke it up. Like some kind of, you know what I'm talking about? I wish that Brom had really gone fucking nasty with it. But again, for what it was, I enjoyed it. Now, there was a point in time when, as I was contemplating the rules of engagement, the magic, and everything like that, and I found myself wondering if humans are a part of nature, why did Abatha not just use her when she was being tortured and kept in that cage and all this stuff? Why she didn't use her magic, not even just in that scene, but throughout the book to control these humans, right? Because humans are a part of nature. That's one of the core themes in the book, I feel like. But then I remembered that the story shows the creatures like the snakes exercising free will, right? There's a moment when Forrest, the little wild folk, the opossum, is trying to call the snakes out from their dens so that they will attack Abatha, and they just don't do it. They ignore the calls from the wild folk. And that signifies that control is not absolute. I think it highlights the story's theme of mutual respect and agency in nature rather than domination. Now, overall, I do feel like Slewfoot was a well-written book. It wasn't overindulgent, which made it an easy and quick read, at least for me. I feel like the story followed classic horror tropes. There was nothing in the story that was unexpected. I feel like it did follow almost like a formulaic writing. Now, the story did follow classic horror tropes, but it did add those unique elements like that third person omniscient narration that I was talking about and a nuanced portrayal of this devil figure. So even though there was nothing about the story that was unexpected, it was rather formulaic in the way that it all played out. Everything that happened was expected, including the ending. I still enjoyed it, right? Not every book has to break the mold. Sometimes writing a good book is about writing something that everyone expects in an unexpected way or in a unique way, adding your own personal flair and your own personal touch. And I think that Brom did that very well with this book. I was like, when we get to the ending, that image of Abatha and the wild folk living in this almost like an alternative realm, the way that these two hunters get there through this magical spell. It was unsettling if you're in the position of the hunters, but if you're a fan of Abatha, then it was a really well done ending. I did appreciate it. I really don't care that these two rapist fucking hunters ended up getting eaten or sacrificed to the pawpaw tree or whatever was going on. I feel like it was very satisfying that Abatha and Samson got to live in the wilderness and continue their rituals and their sacrifices and stuff like that. I was with it. I was on board. I feel like this was a very good addition to the folk horror genre. It had memorable characters, thoughtful themes, and a compelling atmosphere. Aside from those brief issues that I mentioned, the historical accuracy regarding both Abatha acquiring the land, ownership of this land, as well as the portrayal of indigenous people in this book, those were two of the major flaws that I would consider this book to have. But other than that, it was a very standard, solid read. Now, if you've read Slewfoot, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Did you agree with me, or are there things that surprised you or that you loved? Did you feel like there was anything amiss? Let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this deep dive, don't forget to like and subscribe for more bookish content. Until next time, guys.